The cohort record for Section 12 listed 41 names the morning Cadet Eshin Rao arrived. Kalith Sav had counted them twice because the registrar's glyph script was smudged where it met the Terran transliteration, and she did not trust a smudge. 40 species across the compact held seats in the Tessavar Joint Service Academy, but in the 9 years since its founding, only 3 Terrans had ever enrolled. 2 had transferred out within a single cycle. The third, a quiet engineering cadet 2 terms ahead of Kalith's year, was rumored to eat his lunches alone in the maintenance corridor beneath the thermal plant, which she found simultaneously pitiful and unsettling. Section 12 was not a prestigious posting. The Tessavar administrators phrased it diplomatically, adaptive cohesion track. Everyone else called it the catch-up class. 41 cadets drawn from species that had joined the compact within the last 50 standard years, species whose physiological baselines fell outside the training parameters designed for the compact's founding races. They were here because no standard section could accommodate them, and no one in the administration wanted to explain why to 41 sets of parents spread across 9 star systems. Kalith was Vreth, 4-armed, lightly scaled along the jawline and forearms, her metabolism running cooler than most species in the section. She had scored in the upper third on every entrance metric and resented being sorted into Section 12 anyway. Her admissions file, she later learned, carried a single annotation from the placement algorithm, Species Social Integration Index below threshold. Recommend adaptive track. She had never met a human in person. The xenobiology primer in her secondary schooling had described Terrans as bilateral endurance predators from a high-gravity, high-oxygen world with a statistically improbable number of apex carnivores, active volcanoes, and tectonic instabilities. She remembered the primer's summary line, remarkable physiological resilience, social integration patterns, variable. Variable. The compact loved that word. It meant we don't understand them and we're not sure we want to. Rao walked in 14 minutes before first muster on the day. The section started falling apart. It had been fracturing for weeks, if Kalith was honest, since well before she noticed the cracks. But the morning he arrived was the morning the fracture became a fault line anyone could see. The problem was mechanical. Section 12 ran mixed-species squad drills, and no 2 species in the section moved the same way. The Vreth locked joints for stability under load. The Pelori flowed low to the ground on articulated spines, fast and fluid, but unable to brace against lateral force. The Torvani were broad-shouldered and slow-pivoting, built for raw power across flat terrain but clumsy on anything uneven. The Dasyk were fast but fragile, hollow-boned, airborne-capable, prone to stress fractures if they braced against anything heavier than their own mass. Commander Yell, the section's lead instructor, a Torvani career officer with a jaw like a blast shield and a voice like gravel dropped from a height, had spent 7 weeks trying to build squads that could clear a basic coordinated obstacle relay, and every configuration he tried failed. Not by narrow margins. Catastrophically. Squads couldn't synchronize entry timing because each species' neuromuscular response operated on a different clock. Couldn't match pace through the crawl segment because a Pelori crawled 3 times faster than a Torvani. Couldn't trust each other on the load-bearing wall because a Dasyk couldn't catch a falling Torvani, and a Vreth wouldn't release a grip fast enough for a Pelori to slide through a hold gap. The section had responded the way any group of frustrated adolescents responds, by sorting itself into species clusters. Vreth sat with Vreth in the mess hall. Pelori pooled along the left wall of the common area, their low-slung bodies forming a quiet archipelago of articulated spines. The 3 Dasyk perched together in the back row of every lecture, literally perched, on the seat backs, because they preferred elevated surfaces and no one made room for them anywhere else. And the Torvani, who were the plurality at 16 cadets, spread across the center of every room as if they owned it, because in the compact's military tradition, the Torvani usually did. Calith's Squad 4, contained a Vreth pair herself and a male named Sevreth who rarely spoke even by Vreth standards, 2 Pelori, Tessic and Rael, and a Torvani named Dren who communicated primarily through barked orders nobody followed. Their relay time was the worst in the section. Their coordination score was so low that the assessment system had flagged them for possible disbandment, which would have distributed them into other failing squads that didn't want them. Commander Yell introduced the new arrival with the efficiency of someone ticking a box on a form he hadn't read. Cadet Rao, Terran, assigned Section 12, Squad 4, questions later. Rao was unremarkable at first glance, at least by compact standards, medium height by most galactic averages. Brown skin, dark hair cut short enough that Calith could see the shape of his skull, a face that looked like it hadn't decided yet whether to be young or just permanently tired. He wore the same gray intake jumpsuit every new cadet wore, and he carried his kit bag over one shoulder like it weighed nothing, which to a Vreth meant either it was empty or humans were stronger than they looked. He crossed the room to the Squad 4 bench, set his bag down, looked at each of them, Calith, Sevrath, Tessic, Rael, Dren, and said nothing, sat, folded his hands in his lap, waited. She decided she hated him immediately for the sitting and waiting. It felt like judgment. Like he was taking a reading of them the way the assessment system took readings, silently, without context, assigning values to things he didn't understand. The first drill was a disaster in a section already defined by disasters, a standard synchronized wall breach. 5 cadets, now 6, with Rao, had to reach the top of a 9-meter friction wall within a 6-second window of each other. If any member exceeded the window, the whole squad failed. They had failed it 11 consecutive times before Rao joined. With Rao, they failed it an even 12. He climbed well, Calith would give him that. His fingers found holds that the wall's texture randomizer hadn't intended, and he moved with an economy she associated with species that had evolved under heavier gravity than the Tessavar standard. But he finished second, 3 seconds ahead of Dren, 9 seconds ahead of the Pelori, and the window shattered because Vreth ascent patterns locked at the halfway point for a mandatory neurological grip reset that no amount of urgency could override. "Your body stalls," Rao asked her after wiping chalk analog off his palms, not unkindly, factually. "My joints lock under vertical strain," Calith said, keeping her voice flat. "It is neurological, I cannot suppress it." He nodded once, filing that behind the tired face. She expected the look she'd gotten from every Torvani squad leader she'd ever been paired with, the slight jaw shift that meant recalculating her as dead weight, adjusting the internal math to account for a liability. Rao didn't give her that look. He turned to Tessic and asked the same kind of question: how she moved, where she slowed, what hurt, how long her articulated spine could sustain lateral pressure. Tessic answered in a whisper. She was the smallest cadet in the section, a Pelori barely past adolescence whose chromatophores, Pelori skin shifted color under stress, had been locked in a pale, anxious white for most of the 7 weeks. She'd spent that time being told she was the weakest link in every squad she'd joined. Rao crouched to her level. The Pelori were ground dwellers, their eye line low, and listened with the patience of someone who had all day. Then he turned to Dren, to Sevrath, the same questions adapted. How does your body move? Where does it fail? What does it do well that you've been told doesn't matter? By evening he'd spoken to every member of Squad 4. He hadn't given a single suggestion, hadn't offered a plan, hadn't said anything about the wall drill at all. He just asked questions, listened to the answers, and said thank you in that flat Terran voice. That evening, Calith found him in the squad bay studying the section's drill footage on a borrowed datapad. She hadn't come to talk to him. She'd come to retrieve a thermal wrap she'd left on her bunk frame, and he happened to be sitting 2 bunks away, cross-legged on the floor, scrolling through wall breach replays at half speed. "You are watching our failures," she said. "I'm watching how you move," he corrected without looking up. She sat on her bunk despite herself and watched him watch. He wasn't studying the wall, she could tell, because he kept pausing on frames where cadets were mid-transition, not mid-climb. The moments between grips. The moments where Tessic's spine shifted angle to redistribute load she hadn't been able to hold. The moments where Dren's shoulders committed before his feet did. A Torvani pattern that wasted half a second every cycle, but was neurologically hardwired. The wall isn't the problem, Rao said after a while. Elaborate. The wall is just a wall. The problem is that everyone is climbing their own wall. You're climbing it 6 different ways with 6 different internal clocks. That's 6 walls. Calith considered this. Commander Yell's solution has been to drill until synchronization emerges through repetition. Has it emerged? No. Then it won't. You can't drill 6 different physiologies into one pattern. The pattern has to hold 6 physiologies. He said it flatly, the way someone states atmospheric pressure. No malice, no superiority. Just a reading of conditions on the ground, delivered with the same economy he applied to climbing. Calith took her thermal wrap and left, but she lay on her bunk that night turning his words over, and she did not sleep well. The next morning, before muster, Rao approached Commander Yell. Calith watched from the Squad 4 bench because she had learned in 7 weeks that nothing good happened when a cadet approached Commander Yell voluntarily. Permission to run Squad 4 through a modified version of the wall drill, Commander. Yell stared at him for 4 full seconds. Calith counted. You have been in this section for 1 day, Cadet. Yes, Commander. You are proposing to alter a drill framework that was designed by the Tessavar Integrated Training Authority and approved by the Compact Training Board. I am proposing to climb differently, Commander. The wall stays the same. Yell's jaw flexed. Calith knew that flex. It preceded either a dismissal or a punishment detail. Instead, Yell said, you have until 3rd bell. If your squad's time does not improve, you will run the standard version twice, at double incline. Rao's modification was simple in the way that simple things look obvious only after someone says them. Instead of everyone starting at the base and racing upward simultaneously, the standard method, built for species with uniform physiology, he staggered the start by capability. The Pelori went first. Tessic and Rail launched low and fast along the first 3 meters, where the wall's texture randomizer produced the fine-grained surface their articulated spines gripped best. At the 3-meter mark, they anchored and became a living platform, their bodies bridging holds that no rigid-limbed climber could reach between. Calith and Sevrath went second, stepping onto the Pelori platform to bypass the low wall section where Vreth joints locked earliest. They reached the mid-wall zone where their forearmed grip was the strongest hold on the surface, and they locked. Which was exactly what Vreth bodies wanted to do at that angle. The lock reflex became an anchor instead of a failure point. Dren went third, using the Vreth brace to skip the mid-wall entirely, hauling his Torvani mass straight to the high zone where raw strength could power through. And Rao went last, reading the gaps, adjusting his line in real time, filling whatever role the sequence needed. They failed the first attempt because the timing was unfamiliar. The second because Rail's platform shifted half a meter left under unexpected load. The third because Tessic, the smallest cadet in the section, the one everyone called the weak link, panicked when she felt Calith's full weight press down on her spine and started to buckle. Rao dropped beside her in the break between attempts. Calith was close enough to hear. Your articulated segments distribute weight laterally, he said, same flat voice. I checked the species database. Your spine is built for exactly this. On your homeworld, Pelori carry loads twice your body weight across tidal flats. You aren't failing. Your body is working. You just have to let it. Tessic's chromatophores, the stress white that had been her default color for 7 weeks, shifted, slowly, from white to a steadier blue-gray. Caliph had never seen that color on Tessic before. It took her a moment to recognize what it meant. Confidence. On the fourth attempt, Tessic held. She held and Caliph climbed and locked, and felt Dren's full Torvani weight press down on her upper arms, and she held too, because if the smallest cadet in the section could hold, then the Vreth could hold, and Sevreth locked beside her. 4 arms braced wide and Dren reached the top and Rao came up last, hand over hand, not fast but certain, and the clock stopped, and the 6-second window held. Squad 4 completed the synchronized wall breach for the first time in 12 weeks. Commander Yell entered the time, still slow, well outside competitive range, into the training log, and moved on to the next squad without comment. But Caliph saw him replay the footage that evening on his own datapad, alone in the instructor's alcove. She saw him pause on the same frames Rao had paused on. She saw him replay Tessic's hold 3 times. It didn't fix the section. One drill completion did not erase 7 weeks of species-stratified failure. The clusters remained, Vreth with Vreth, Pelori along the left wall, the Dacic on their perches, and Squad 4's improvement was dismissed by most of the section as a novelty. The human had done something clever, the way Terrans apparently did, and it wouldn't translate. But it translated within Squad 4. Over the next 3 days, Rao extended the staggered capability approach to every drill on the rotation. The crawl segment, Pelori first through the narrowest sections, then Vreth bridging the gaps, then Torvani powering through the wide stretches. The load carry, Dren as engine, Vreth as lateral stabilizers, Pelori navigating the path from ground level, Rao adjusting loads in real time so no single body bore more than it could. Every drill, the same principle. Stop trying to make everyone move the same way. Start asking what each body does best and build the sequence around the answer. Squad 4's scores climbed. Not spectacularly, they didn't vault to the top of the section, but they stopped being the worst. They moved from last to 5th, then to 4th. The assessment system removed the disbandment flag, and small things changed that the scores didn't capture. Tessic's chromatophores settled into a stable blue-gray that Caliph began to associate with readiness. Dren stopped barking orders and started asking questions, awkwardly, grudgingly, but asking. Sevrath, who rarely spoke, began tapping his lower left arm against surfaces in a Vreth signaling pattern that meant I'm ready before each drill, a gesture so automatic and trusting that it could not have been rehearsed. The section noticed, mostly with suspicion. Voreth, the Torvani from Squad 2 who considered himself the section's natural leader by virtue of mass and volume, called it a trick in the mess hall. The human is gaming the metrics, he said. Squad 4 isn't getting better, they're just gaming the assessment parameters. Dren stood up from his seat. Come run the wall with us, he said. Bring your squad, we'll run it side by side. Same wall, same clock. Then tell me who's gaming what. Voreth didn't take the offer, but 4 cadets from other squads approached Squad for that evening, 2 Pelori from Squad 6, a Dacic from Squad 7, and a Vreth from Squad 3, asking how the staggered approach worked. Rao sat with them in the common area for 2 hours, drawing diagrams on scrap material with a blunt stylus, asking each one the same questions he'd asked Squad 4. How does your squad move? Where does it break? What does each species do well that the drill framework ignores? He didn't tell them to copy Squad 4's configuration. He told them to build their own, from their own composition. The 2 Pelori from Squad 6 had been paired with 3 Dacic and a single Torvani, a radically different mix. Rao helped them see that the Dacic could scout overhead while the Pelori cleared low, that the lone Torvani didn't have to be the anchor if the 3 Dacic could alternate high-point perches and relay holds down. It was a different pattern for a different squad, built from the same principle. Squad 6 cleared their first wall breach 2 days later. Their time was worse than Squad 4's, but they'd never completed one before. The Dacic from Squad 7, Issar, the hollow-boned flyer Caliph would later watch scout a submerged ledge from the air, went back to her own squad and proposed a modification to their crawl segment approach that shaved 4 seconds off their time. The change leaked into spaces beyond the drill yard. In the section's tactical theory lecture, a weekly session that Commander Yell ran with a projector, a gravel voice, and an expectation that cadets would sit in silence, a DASIC from Squad 3 raised a wing to ask a question. It was the first question any DASIC had asked in 7 weeks. The question was about load distribution across mixed-body formations, and it referenced the wall breach footage that half the section had apparently been watching on their own datapads. Yell answered it. Then a Pelori from Squad 5 asked a follow-up about terrain adaptive roles switching in riverine environments, and a Torvani from Squad 8, not a Squad 4 ally, not one of the cadets who'd come to Rao for help, said, without prompting, "We had the same problem on the crawl segment. Our DASIC kept trying to crawl with us instead of flying the route ahead." The lecture ran 40 minutes over its scheduled time. Yell did not cut it short. That evening, Caliph passed the common area and saw something the section had never produced, a mixed-species study group. 3 Torvani, 2 Pelori, and a DASIC, hunched over a datapad showing obstacle relay footage, arguing not about who had failed, but about sequence design, about which body went where and when and why. The argument was loud, clumsy, and full of wrong assumptions. It was also the first time Caliph had heard cadets from 3 different species disagree about tactics without it becoming a grievance about biology. Commander Yell logged the times. He did not comment. But Caliph noticed that he stopped assigning punishment drills to squads that experimented with non-standard configurations, which was the closest thing to encouragement a Torvani officer could give without admitting he'd noticed. The 4th day after the wall breach, Vorith made his move. Not against Rao, he was too careful for that. He went to Commander Yell with a formal grievance that Squad 4's modified approach violated Standard Drill Protocol 9, which mandated simultaneous start for all synchronized exercises. The simultaneous start rule existed because the Compact Training Board had designed every drill around species uniform cohorts, and nobody had updated the regulations when the adaptive track was created. Yell heard the grievance in the section assembly. Procedure required it. Vorith cited 3 regulation numbers, a subsection, and an annotation from the training manual that Caliph suspected he'd memorized overnight. His voice was steady. His argument was technically correct. Rao sat on the Squad 4 bench and said nothing. Yell's response was 2 sentences. The grievance is noted. Protocol 9 applies to standard configuration sections. Section 12's configuration is, by administrative designation, adaptive. He turned to the assembly board and wrote the next day's drill assignments. The grievance died in the air between the regulation and the reality. Vorith's jaw locked for 6 seconds, Caliph counted, and then he sat down. He didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. But that evening, Caliph saw something she hadn't expected. Vorith in the equipment bay, alone, studying his own squad's drill footage on his datapad, scrolling slowly, pausing on transitions, watching the way Rao had watched. He was not asking for help. Torvani didn't, but he was learning to look. The deeper fracture came 8 days after Rao's arrival, and it was structural. Commander Yell announced the mid-cycle assessment, a 72-hour field trial in the Tessavar upland range. Squads would operate independently for the first 2 days, scored on navigation, resource acquisition, and shelter construction. The 3rd day would bring a final coordinated objective that no one would learn until they were already in the field. Section 12's aggregate assessment score would determine whether the adaptive cohesion track continued to exist as a program. If this section fails the aggregate threshold, Yell said, his voice carrying across the assembly hall without amplification, a Torvani vocal trait, born of a species that had evolved on windy steppes, the Compact Training Board will dissolve the adaptive track and redistribute all of you into species-specific training cohorts. You will train with your own kind. You will never share a cross-species unit posting." He let that settle. Caliph watched the room divide in real time, and it was the cleanest split she had ever seen. Half the section, mostly Torvani and a cluster of Vreth who had given up on integration, visibly relaxed. Species-specific tracks meant training with people who moved the way you moved. No more failed relays. No more wall breaches with species whose bodies refused to cooperate. It sounded easier, simpler, better. The other half, the Pelori, the Dacic, the small handful of cadets who had started to believe, went rigid. Because species-specific tracks also meant being locked into monoculture units that would never interoperate, never serve alongside anyone different, never develop the adaptive capacity that the Compact's founding charter had intended. Rao's expression didn't change. Caliph had learned by then that it rarely did. That evening, arguments broke out in the barracks. Not physical, the Compact's conduct code held even under stress, but loud enough that Commander Yell's assistant instructor, a younger Torvani named Emrivet, had to walk the corridor twice to restore order. The Torvani majority wanted the section to fail. Caliph heard it plainly through the partition between the Vreth berths and the Torvani bay. Voices arguing that a clean dissolution was better than another cycle of embarrassment, that species-specific training would let them compete for postings instead of dragging each other down. A Pelori from Squad 5, Caliph never learned her name, said something back. It was quiet, the way Pelori voices always were, but it carried. "You want to go back to training with your own kind because your own kind makes it easy. We don't have that. There are 11 of us in the entire Compact military. Species-specific means we train alone." The barracks went silent. It stayed silent for a long time. The night before deployment, the tension was physical. Caliph could feel it in her thermal regulation. Her Vreth metabolism ran colder when cortisol analog spiked, and the barracks felt 10 degrees below standard. She found Rao in the equipment bay, hand-pressing sheets of fibrous packing material into flat rectangles using a maintenance clamp. "What are you making?" "Charts, terrain overlays of the upland range. I pulled the geological survey from the Academy's public archive. The datapads have navigational capability." "Datapads crash." "These don't." She watched him press another sheet, trim the edges with a maintenance blade, and begin inking contour lines with a marking stylus he'd borrowed from the signals lab. His hand was steady. The lines were precise but not neat, functional, not decorative. He drew the way he climbed. Economy first, appearance nowhere. "You expect the electronics to fail," she said. "I expect everything to fail. Then I work backward from what's left." Caliph picked up one of the finished sheets. The contour lines tracked thermal vent patterns across the upland plateau, geologically fixed features that had been stable for centuries. She recognized the cartographic logic. If your navigation system dies, follow heat signatures that don't move. "This is how Terrans plan," she said. "Not a question." "This is how Terrans survive," he said. "We come from a planet where the ground shakes, the water rises, the air catches fire, and half the animals want to eat you. You learn to carry a backup for the backup, and you learn that the backup nobody can break is the one you make with your hands." It was the most he'd ever said about Earth. Caliph filed it beside the growing inventory of Terran traits she could not explain but could not dismiss. Vorith, passing the equipment bay on his way to the latrine, paused long enough to see the paper charts spread across the workbench. He made a sound, a low Torvani exhalation that translated roughly as contempt for wasted effort. "Arts and crafts," he said. "That will help." Rao didn't look up. "You're welcome to make your own. I have a datapad with full navigational capability." "Good." Vorith left. Caliph stayed. She picked up a blank sheet and began pressing it flat with her upper arms while her lower arms held the clamp steady, 4 arms doing 4 things, a pattern the assessment system had never tested for. Rao glanced at her work, said nothing, and went back to his contour lines. They worked in silence for an hour. It was the first time Caliph had felt useful at something that wasn't a drill. Squad 4 deployed to Grid Quadrant 7 of the upland range at dawn. Caliph carried the navigation kit. Dren carried the shelter components, heavy composite panels that only a Torvani could manage across rough terrain without mechanical assistance. Tessic and Rail carried rations and the medical pack. Sevrath carried the emergency thermal gear, a Vreth specialty, and Rao carried the communication relay and, slung across his back in a tube he'd fabricated from maintenance scrap the previous evening, a set of hand-drawn terrain overlays on sheets of pressed fibrous material he'd made from packing crates. "You prepared charts," Caliph said, staring at the hand-inked contour lines, "on dead tree substrate. Paper, and it doesn't crash, run out of charge, or get jammed by mineral fog." She decided to file that alongside the growing list of Terran behaviors she could not explain, but could not dismiss. Day 1 was navigation. The upland range was a volcanic plateau networked with thermal vents, fog channels, and razor-edged lava tubes that the Tessavar considered gentle terrain. For Vreth, the ambient temperature was oppressive. For the Dacic and other squads, thermal updrafts made flight unpredictable. For Torvani, the glassy volcanic surface reflected heat and offered minimal friction. When the fog closed in thick, mineral-laced, refracting sensor pulses into useless scatter, every squad's electronic navigation failed simultaneously. Comm chatter spiked, squads calling for recalibration, squads reporting position uncertainty. Squad 9, led by Voreth, reported walking in a circle for 40 minutes. Rao pulled out his paper charts, oriented them against the thermal vent pattern. The vents were geologically fixed, their positions unchanged for centuries, and walked. "Follow the warm spots," he said. "They don't move." They reached checkpoint Alpha 14 minutes ahead of the nearest squad. Caliph watched Rao fold his charts carefully, and she thought, he expected this. He built the backup because he expected the primary to fail. Not because he was smarter than the Tessavar engineers, but because somewhere in his species' history, on a planet where everything broke regularly, someone had learned that you always carry something that works without power. Between Checkpoint Alpha and Checkpoint Bravo, the terrain shifted from open plateau to a maze of lava tubes, narrow, branching, some stable, some with floors thin enough to crack under a Torvani's weight. The fog was thicker here, channeled into the tubes by convection, and visibility dropped to arm's length. Rao stopped the squad at the maze's entrance and knelt. Caliph watched him press his palm flat against the volcanic glass, hold it there for 10 seconds, then move it to another spot. "What are you doing?" "Feeling for vibration. Stable lava tubes transmit ground tremor differently than cracked ones. The sound changes. You can feel geological stability through your palm. Terrans have about 17,000 mechanoreceptors in each hand. Mostly in the fingertips." He moved to a third spot, paused, then pointed left. "This way. The floor is solid for at least 40 meters." Tessic, who had been pressed low against the ground, pylori sensory organs were ventral, belly down, lifted her head. "I can feel it too," she said quietly. "The vibration pattern. The right branch hums differently." Rao looked at her. "Show me." Tessic flowed forward on her articulated spine, belly against the glass, and stopped at the branch point. She pressed her ventral surface flat and was still for a long moment. Then she pointed left, the same direction Rao had indicated. "Your species reads ground vibration through your whole body," Rao said. "You're better at this than I am." It was the first time anyone in Section 12 had told Tessic she was better at anything. Her chromatophores shifted to a deep, steady blue that Caliph had never seen, darker than confidence. something closer to pride. They made it through the lava tube maze without a single misstep. Tessic led the final third, her Pelori ground sense guiding the squad through branches that the datapads, had they been working, would have flagged as impassable. Behind them, they could hear the distant sound of Torvani boots cracking thin lava tube floors, other squads, navigating by mass instead of by feel. At Checkpoint Bravo, Squad 4 logged their arrival 12 minutes ahead of schedule. The comm relay crackled with status updates from other squads. Squad 3 had lost a Dacic to a stress fracture from a bad landing on a thermal updraft. Squad 8 had a Vreth in thermal distress. The ambient heat had pushed past her regulation threshold, and her joints had locked in a full-body stasis that required 2 Torvani to carry her to a cooling station. Squad 9 had finally found the checkpoint but had burned an hour and 40 minutes doing it, and Voreth's voice on the comm was clipped in a way that Calith recognized as Torvani frustration approaching its functional ceiling. Rao listened to the comm traffic, said nothing, and began marking Checkpoint Bravo's exact thermal signature on his paper chart for the return route. Day 2 was shelter construction. Each squad had to build a structure that could protect its members through a simulated storm cycle, high winds, temperature drop, debris impact. The specs varied by species composition. Calith monitored comm chatter and learned that most squads built for their majority species, and told the minority to endure. A Torvani-heavy squad built a Torvani shelter and expected their lone Pelori to fold herself into a corner designed for rigid bodies. Squad 3's Vreth majority built for cold tolerance and left their Dacic members shivering in a structure with no airflow, because Vreth sealed every gap instinctively, and Dacic needed open circulation for their respiratory membranes. Rao built for everyone. He didn't announce it, he walked the site. Asked Tessic what spine angle she needed to rest at full extension. Asked Calith what temperature her scales could regulate down to before cognitive impairment. Asked Dren how much headroom a Torvani required to avoid the claustrophobic stress response that Calith hadn't known Torvani experienced. Asked Sevrath about airflow requirements for his sensory nodes. Asked Rael about Pelori ground channel drainage. Then he assigned construction tasks by capability. Calith's 4 arms made her the fastest at lashing vent piping into a frame. Dren's mass anchored the base plates against storm loads. Tessic and Rael wove a ground channel using their articulated spines to bend flexible volcanic glass into a shape no rigid-bodied species could achieve, a flowing, organic passage that fit Pelori anatomy perfectly. Sevrath rigged the thermal system with the instinctive precision of a cold world specialist. The shelter was ugly. It looked like wreckage repurposed by creative scavengers. But it was warm where Calith needed it warm, ventilated where Dren needed airflow, open where the Pelori needed ground space, tall where the Torvani needed headroom, and dry everywhere. When the simulated storm hit at 300, Squad 4 slept through it. 3 squads requested emergency extraction before dawn. Squad 9 lost their shelter to structural collapse tall, narrow, optimized for Torvani height, and the wind found the leverage point Voreth hadn't accounted for. They spent the night in a lava tube while Voreth raged at his squad for 20 minutes about whose fault it was. The Pelori in his squad, a quiet female named Sor, had suggested reinforcing the base with a lateral weave, the kind Pelori built instinctively on their tidal homeworld. Voreth had overruled her. The wind proved Sor right. Calith learned this from comm chatter the next morning, and she filed it beside the understanding that was slowly forming. Every squad that built for one species and told the rest to endure was a squad that had volunteered to be weaker than it needed to be. Squad 4 passed the shelter assessment with the highest structural integrity score in the section. Commander Yell logged the number without comment. That morning before the Day 3 briefing arrived, something unexpected happened. Voreth walked to the Squad 4 shelter, not to the squad, to the shelter. He stood outside it for a long time, jaw working, studying the mismatched construction. The Pelori ground channels, the four-armed Vreth lashing, the Torvani height clearance that someone had thought to include even though the squad only had one Torvani. Kalith watched from inside, through a gap in the vent piping. She expected mockery. Instead, Vorith reached out and touched one of the lashing joints, the one Kalith had tied with all four arms simultaneously, and his fingers traced the weave pattern as if he was trying to understand how it held. He stood there for what felt like a full minute. Then he turned and walked back toward his squad's lava tube, past the collapsed shelter they hadn't rebuilt, and Kalith saw him stop beside Sor, the Pelori whose advice he'd overruled. He didn't say anything. He stood near her for a moment, and then he moved on. But Sor's chromatophores shifted from the dull gray she'd been wearing since the collapse to something slightly warmer, and Kalith thought that Pelori might have a better instinct for unspoken apologies than Vreth did. Later that day, when the section gathered for the Day 3 briefing, Vorith did not position himself at the center of the group. He stood slightly to the side, near the edge where the Dacic had perched, and when one of them shifted to give him room, he shook his head once. A small gesture. Stay where you are. Day 3 brought the final objective, and when the briefing arrived, Kalith read it twice. A full section relay, not squad level, all 41 cadets operating as a single unit, transporting a cargo container across 12 kilometers of broken terrain, ravines, water crossings, scree fields, a final vertical ascent in 4 hours. The container was massed to exceed any single species carrying capacity. Scoring, binary, complete or fail. Every squad had spent 2 days working independently. They hadn't trained together at section level. Most hadn't spoken to cadets outside their species since the clusters formed. And now the assessment that would determine Section 12's survival required all of them to function as a single organism across terrain that punished every species differently. Commander Yell's voice on the relay, "This is the objective. There is no alternative." The section gathered at the start line. The container sat on a low-friction sled, a rectangular composite mass the size of a Torvani ground transport, 300 kilograms, possibly more. The section stood around it and did nothing. 4 minutes bled away while cadets argued about formation. Vorith assumed command by default largest, loudest, backed by the Torvani plurality. He ordered the same species role configuration Commander Yell had tried for 7 weeks. Torvani drag, Vreth brace flanks, Pelori clear path, Dacic scout overhead. They moved the container 200 meters. Then the terrain dropped into a narrow volcanic ravine, and the formation collapsed. The Torvani couldn't fit shoulder to shoulder on the ravine floor. The Vreth flank bracing was useless on a downslope. The Pelori path clearing was meaningless when the path was a crack in rock barely wide enough for the sled. Vorith ordered a halt. Time hemorrhaged. The clock showed 23 minutes elapsed and the ravine stretched ahead for at least a kilometer. Dren moved first. Not to challenge Vorith, Torvani didn't challenge other Torvani in public without a formal dominance contest, but to stand at the ravine edge beside Rao, who had been looking down since the formation collapsed. The two of them stood side by side, the Torvani who had learned to ask questions and the Terran who had taught him how, and they studied the terrain together. "The Pelori," Dren said, not a question, he could see it now. Rao nodded. Dren turned to Vorith. In Torvani hierarchy, what happened next was significant, a subordinate addressing a self-appointed leader with a tactical proposal that contradicted the standing order. Dren didn't frame it as defiance. He framed it as Torvani pragmatism, which was the only language Vorith's instincts would accept. "The formation doesn't fit the terrain," Dren said. "Same problem as the wall. Different shape for a different obstacle. The Pelori go low, the Dacic go high, we control the ropes from the lip." Vorith's jaw flexed. 26 minutes on the clock. The ravine didn't care about hierarchy. Kalith stepped forward. "The ravine is too narrow for Torvani formation," she said. "Level, Informational. The Pelori can guide the sled from below if your people control descent from the lip. The Dacic call the route. The Vreth hold anchor at every transition. Voreth looked at her, looked at Dren, looked at the clock, 28 minutes, looked at the ravine. Do it, he said. The Pelori dropped in. Tessic and Rael took forward position, their spines pressing against the sled's base, guiding it through the channel centimeter by centimeter with a precision no rigid body could match. The two Pelori from Squad 6 joined them, the same cadets who had come to Rao for help days earlier, and the four of them moved the sled like water through a pipe. Sor from Squad 9 dropped in last, without being asked, her chromatophore steady, her spine angled for load, her silence louder than anything Voreth had said all morning. Above, the Torvani fed rope and controlled descent, their mass finally an asset. 16 Torvani braced along the ravine lip, each one an anchor point that no other species could provide. 3 Dacic flew relay through the ravine's wind channel, calling turns and drops before the sled reached them. The Vreth held anchor at every transition, 4 arms locked into volcanic rock, immovable. 11 minutes, the sled cleared the ravine. On the far side, something changed. Not a single moment, a gradient. The section didn't return to Voreth's formation because it couldn't. The terrain kept transforming, open flats to scree fields where Torvani mass sank, scree to a water crossing no one had prepared for, the crossing to a narrow rock chimney before the final ascent. Each change demanded a different species in front. And each time, the transition happened a little faster. The first species swap after the ravine took 3 minutes of argument. The second took 90 seconds. By the scree field, it took 30 seconds. The Pelori felt the surface give, called it, and the Dacic were already aloft before anyone gave an order. The scree field nearly ended the attempt. Loose volcanic gravel over a steep grade, the sled wanted to slide sideways, and the Torvani couldn't dig in without sinking to their knees. 2 minutes of wheel spinning while the clock burned past the 90-minute mark. Then a Dacic from Squad 3, a cadet named Vis who had barely spoken since the stress fracture in her squad had shaken everyone's confidence, called down from 15 meters. There's a rock spine running diagonally. Solid basalt. 20 meters left of your current line. They shifted the sled. The Pelori found the rock spine first, felt it through their ventral sensors the way Tessic had felt the stable lava tubes, and guided the Torvani onto it. Solid footing. The sled moved. Vis stayed aloft for the rest of the scree field, calling the spine's path from above. Nobody had asked her. Nobody had assigned her a role. She had seen a problem from a vantage point no ground dweller had, and she had solved it because the terrain needed what her body could do. The Vreth led the water crossing. Calith's 4 arms distributed grip across submerged stones, pulling the sled while Pelori swam beneath to prevent grounding. The Torvani couldn't lead this segment. Their mass drove them into soft riverbed, and for the first time in Section 12's history, the Torvani followed. Sevrath braced the sled's rear with all 4 arms locked at different angles, each arm compensating for a different current vector, and Calith heard a Torvani from Squad 8 mutter something she didn't catch. She asked Dren later what it had been. He said 4 arms, Dren told her, like he was seeing them for the first time. The species the algorithm had flagged for low social integration became the anchor point for the entire water crossing. Calith felt the weight of the sled through her grip, felt the current trying to twist it, felt the Pelori beneath stabilizing the base, and she held. Not because someone ordered it. Because the section needed her body to do exactly what her body did best. And for the first time since she'd been assigned to the catch-up class, the need and the capability were the same thing. A Dacic cadet from Squad 7, Issar, hollow-boned and quick, spotted a submerged ledge that would have jammed the sled, and called it from the air before the ground team reached it. No one had asked Issar to scout. She had simply flown up because she could see that the ground-level view was insufficient, and the instinct to cover a blind spot was stronger than the habit of waiting for a Torvani to tell her what to do. The rock chimney before the final ascent was the hardest passage, too narrow for Dacic flight, too vertical for Torvani power without anchor points. The Vreth climbed the chimney walls and rigged an anchor chain, Calith on the left wall, Sevrath on the right, their 4 arms spanning the gap like living scaffolding. Dren and the other Torvani powered the sled upward from below, their strength finally applied where no other species had the raw force. Sevrath, on the chimney wall above, hammered in the final anchor point with his lower right arm, while his upper arms held the chain taut, and Calith realized she was watching a Vreth use all 4 arms in 3 different tasks simultaneously. Something the assessment system had never tested for because it had never occurred to the test designers that 4 arms could do 4 things. Vorith climbed beside the sled, not directing, not commanding, climbing. His massive Torvani hands found holds on the chimney wall and he braced himself at the narrowest point where the sled threatened to wedge, and he pushed. Not for Squad 2, not for the Torvani, for the section. Calith saw the moment it happened, the shift in his posture from authority to labor, from leader to lifter, and she understood that it cost him something. Torvani hierarchy was structural, neurological, almost gravitational. For Vorith to subordinate his role to the task required overriding instincts bred across evolutionary time. He did it anyway, because the chimney didn't care about hierarchy any more than the ravine had. And Rao moved between all of them, not leading, not in any way Vorith or Commander Yell would have recognized, connecting. Reading the next terrain transition before they reached it, pointing at Sevrath, anchor point 30 meters left face. Crouching beside a Pelori from Squad 6 he'd never spoken to, the riverbed drops a meter in 12 paces, shift right, calling up to Isar, wind sheer from the south, come in lower. He wasn't the strongest, wasn't the fastest, wasn't the most durable or the most experienced, but he was the only person in the section who had spent his first 8 days learning what every species could do instead of cataloging what they couldn't. They reached the summit with the container intact. The clock read 3 hours, 11 minutes. 49 minutes to spare. The assessment required 4 hours. They had done it in 3 hours and 11 minutes, with a section that had never operated as a unit before that morning. Commander Yell was waiting at the top. He stood in the Torvani Atrest posture and looked at the section, 41 cadets, mud-caked, scaled, feathered, bleeding from scrapes on volcanic glass, standing in a formation no training manual had ever prescribed because it had been invented in real time by people who had no reason to trust each other, except that they had just proven they could. He entered the time into the assessment log. Then he said, quietly enough that only the front rank heard, Section 12's record will reflect this. Calith was in the front rank. She remembered every syllable. That evening in the mess hall, the clusters dissolved. Not dramatically. The Pelori simply sat where there were seats instead of pooling along the left wall. A Dacic Isar landed on the table beside Dren, which a week ago would have been an insult, and Dren shifted his tray to make room without a word. Tessic sat beside a Torvani cadet from Squad 2 and asked about the rock chimney. How had it felt from below? A Pelori from Squad 6 offered one of the Dacic a thermal packet designed for ground dwellers, wrong species, wrong biology, and the Dacic accepted it anyway, wrapping it around her wing joint where a scrape from the chimney wall had stiffened the membrane. The packet didn't fit right. Neither of them cared. Sevrath reached across the table with his lower left arm to pass rail container of thermal paste that Pelori used on strained joints after cold exposure, a gesture so casual that it couldn't have been rehearsed. Calith sat across from Tessic and noted the Pelori's skin color, a steady, rich teal she had never seen on Tessic before. It was not confidence. It was something quieter. Tessic looked like someone who had stopped bracing for the next person to call her the weak link. Rao sat one seat down, eating whatever the mess hall had dispensed. Caliph suspected he couldn't tell the difference between Tessavar military rations and whatever Terrans ate on their volatile homeworld. She suspected he didn't care. "Rao." He looked up, chewing. "Why did you request the adaptive cohesion track? Your entrance metrics were adequate for a standard section. You could have trained with other Terrans in a species-specific cohort." He set his utensil down, chewed, swallowed, took his time the way he took his time with everything, not slowly but deliberately, as if every answer deserved the courtesy of being thought through before it left his mouth. "There are 4 other Terrans at the Tessavar Academy," he said. 3 are in species-specific tracks. 1 eats lunch alone in a maintenance corridor because no one in his section made room for him. Caliph waited. "I looked him up before I shipped out. His name is Patel. He scored in the top 8% on the entrance exam. He requested a cross-species section 3 times. Denied every time. The placement algorithm flagged Terrans as social integration risks. So they put him in a species-specific track with 4 other humans who'd never served alongside anyone different. And when his section ran joint exercises with alien units, nobody included Patel because he'd never trained with them. He eats alone because the system designed around him made sure he'd never learn how to eat with anyone else." Rao looked at his tray, looked back at Caliph. "The standard section trains you to operate with people who move like you do. That's not hard. Any species can learn to coordinate with its own kind. What's hard is learning to work with people who move differently, think differently, lock when you flex, flex when you lock. And you wanted what was hard. I wanted what was real. The compact isn't one species. A unit that only works with itself isn't a unit. It's a club." Caliph did not reply. She looked around the mess hall at 41 cadets from 11 species who had been sorted into a remedial track by an algorithm that measured them against standards none of them fit, who had spent 7 weeks failing because they'd been trying to become the same thing instead of learning to be different things in the right sequence at the right time. Vorith sat 3 tables away, alone for the first time Caliph could remember. The Torvani who usually flanked him had scattered into mixed groups, and Vorith hadn't followed. He was eating in silence, and once, just once, Caliph saw him glance toward the table where Isar the Dacic sat beside Dren, and his jaw worked but produced no sound. She didn't know what that meant in Torvani body language. She thought it might be the closest a Torvani could come to admitting he'd been wrong without saying a word. The cohort record still listed 41 names, but the record did not capture what had changed, that the list had stopped being a roster of separate species and started being a unit. Commander Yell filed his assessment to the Compact Training Board that night. Caliph found out what he'd written weeks later, when the section's continuation was confirmed, and the document entered the Academy's permanent operational record. His assessment was brief. Torvani officers wrote the way they spoke, minimal and load-bearing, trusting the reader to find the weight underneath. 1 line, entered alongside the time log and the assessment scores, and the operational footage from the 12-kilometer relay. Recommend continuation. Section 12 is functional. Caliph read that line in the records office on a quiet afternoon 3 weeks after the field trial, standing alone at a terminal, and she stayed there for a long time thinking about the word functional. In Torvani military language, it was the minimum acceptable rating, above deficient, below effective, well below exemplary. It was the grade you gave to equipment that worked but wasn't impressive. The grade for a system that met its minimum requirements and nothing more. But Commander Yell had served in mixed species units for 26 years. He had watched the Compact's integration mandate fail in section after section, academy after academy, for the better part of a career. He knew what it cost to make 41 cadets from 11 species move as one thing across 12 kilometers of terrain that punished every single one of them differently. He knew that functional for Section 12 was the most extraordinary thing the record could say. She looked at the assessment log beside his recommendation. The scores were there: navigation, shelter, the relay time, 3 hours, 11 minutes. But next to the relay score, in a notation field that the official assessment template provided for additional context, Yell had added 4 words that were not required by any regulation, 4 words that a Torvani career officer had no procedural reason to include. Method: cadet-originated adaptive sequencing. He had named it, not Rao's name. Torvani officers did not credit individual cadets in assessment logs, but he had named the method, had given it a designation that the compact training board would read and file and perhaps remember. He had written it into the record the way Torvani wrote everything: minimal, load-bearing, permanent. Caliph read those 4 words 3 times. Cadet-originated adaptive sequencing. The assessment system had a term for what Section 12 had done now, not because the system had invented it, because a Torvani instructor who had spent 26 years watching integration fail had seen it succeed once, and he had made sure the record knew. The record said functional. The method said the rest. She left the record's office and walked to the mess hall. It was mid-afternoon between meal cycles, and the hall was nearly empty. Rao was there, sitting alone at one of the long tables, eating something from a ration packet and reading a maintenance manual on a borrowed datapad. She sat across from him. Yell wrote cadet-originated adaptive sequencing in the assessment log, she said. Rao looked up. That's a lot of syllables for ask people what they're good at. It is in the permanent record. The compact training board will read it. Good. They may adopt it formally as doctrine. Rao set down the datapad, considered that. Then some bureaucrat will write a regulation about it, and the regulation will specify how to do it for every possible species combination, and in 3 years it'll be just as rigid as the system it replaced. You think that? I think the point was never the method. The point was paying attention. You can't write a regulation that makes people pay attention. Caliph sat with that for a while. Outside the mess hall windows, the Tessavar sky was the particular shade of pale gray that passed for afternoon on a world with a cooler star than Earth's. Somewhere in the Academy's lower corridors, Patel, the Terran who ate alone, was probably finishing his lunch in a maintenance corridor. She thought about mentioning him to Rao. She thought about asking whether Rao had ever gone down there and sat with him. She didn't ask. Some things you don't ask a person who gives every answer the courtesy of being thought through first. Caliph thought the word was probably enough.